Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch by interviewing authors, discussing their books, learning about the writing process, and even, on occasion, chatting live with a panel of authors to discuss topics relevant to both readers and writers. My guest today on the Online for Authors podcast is Vivien Sieber, author of the book Kino and Kinder, A Family's Journey in the Shadow of the Holocaust. In my book review, I stated Kino and Kinder is the story of Paula and her family, and it focuses on life around World War I until Paula's death decades after World War II. Paula, a co-owner with her sister of a theater in Vienna, enjoyed great success until the Nazi takeover. We see her get her son to safety and beg her family to leave, before eventually fleeing to England. Penniless, Paula works as a matron to a hostel for Jewish girls who have fled the Nazis. What was supposed to be a temporary shelter for girls turned into an orphanage spanning several years. Sieber uses letters from these girls, extensive research, and her grandmother's memories to create a story that helps others understand the atrocities of the Holocaust and how this period of time negatively impacted Jewish people, even if they were fortunate enough to escape a work or death camp. This family memoir is a must-read. Welcome to Online for Authors. Today I am chatting with Vivien Sieber, the author of Kino and Kinder, A Family's Journey into the Shadow of the Holocaust. Hello, Vivien. Welcome.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here with me. Before we get started, give us just a quick overview of what a reader could expect if they were to pick up Kino and Kinder.
Well, they get my family story, which goes from my great-grandparents who were drapers in Brno, which was Czechoslovakia, through my grandmother moving to Vienna to open a cinema with her sister in 1915. And the two women ran the cinema really successfully. And I've got these fabulous photographs, historic photographs of grandmother all dressed up at the cinema. They both married. My dad came along, and then very tragically, my grandfather was killed in a road traffic accident. And grandmother went on working, running the cinema, looking after her boys. And then, of course, in 1938, Hitler came along. Of course, he'd already been in Germany for a long time, but the march across the Austrian border was very sudden. And my grandmother and dad were actually standing in their flat, and they watched the procession as it came in through the Ringstrasse in Vienna, which is the main, very palatial road. And she realized she had to send her son to safety. So she sent him to a relative in London. And she followed herself eventually with great difficulty, because of course she had to pay lots of exit taxes. The cinema had been appropriated. Her sister was staying because she'd just been widowed and couldn't think about leaving. And eventually she managed to get some money actually from a former lover, and which must have been hard for an independent woman.
Right.
And escaped to England penniless and became the matron of a hostel for girls saved on the Kinder transport, first in Tynemouth, which is in northeast England, which was a very poor region on the coast. It's just outside Newcastle. And it was moved to Windermere once heavy bombing started. And she cared for the children throughout the war. Now, when my dad died, I inherited his file of contacts with the Kinder, as he wanted to acknowledge the families who run the hostel and, taken financial and all the other responsibilities for children. So I was lucky. I contacted several of the girls, obviously as old ladies, and now there aren't quite so many, sadly. And they just wrote to me in these incredibly moving letters about what it was like leaving their families as young children. So the book is interspersed with writings from the girls and a book my dad wrote that wasn't published. So I've got his experience as well, He was interned on the Isle of Man in Canada, and he kept a daily journal when he was doing that. So there's lots of
Lots
information.
of information. Yeah. And it's a very different look. I have read so I read a Holocaust memoir. It was called a Holocaust family memoir, and it was a man whose mother and father had both been in concentration camps and their experiences. This one isn't about concentration camps, which is very different, I think. A lot of people assume that the Holocaust only touched those who were put into these camps, and yet your book very much shows that it affected everyone.
Yes. I mean, yes,
Everyone.
when I started, which was a bit by accident, I did a family tree, and because there were relatives I'd never heard of, or
Right.
and obviously some of them did die in concentration
Right.
camps.
Right.
But obviously the end of mine is quite in a way hopeful, because the girls went on to have their own families and careers and spread across the world, and so
Right.
they children and great grandchildren.
Right.
And obviously, my father went on to establish himself in England, and I came along. Um, but of course, yes, it's affected everything in many ways.
Right. Right. And I think that was something that was, you know, as an American, sitting over here in my nice little quiet place that nobody ever comes and bombs, right? Like we feel very secure here. I think it's a different way of looking at what happened to those people who were affected by all that was going on that didn't end up directly in a camp or directly in a work group like that. And so for your grandmother, what happened with her was they essentially took over her theater,
Absolutely.
right? And
I,
and and in your words, you tell me, why did they do that? What was their reasoning?
I've got papers from the Austrian archives. I have to say the archives have been very generous and very helpful.
Right.
And you can see that very early on, almost before the Anschluss, before the Nazis arrived in Vienna, the cinema was valued, and there were successive valuations, each worth less than the one before. And basically, then there's this amazing correspondence between people saying, I was a really, really good Nazi. Please give me the cinema. I would be really good at running it. One man actually says, my son's got these qualifications, and I'll pay you if you give him the cinema. And so the probability is that they were going to take the money and give it to Nazi funds.
Right.
But that's not actually written very clearly. But they took anything they could from Jews.
Right. If you were Jewish, you were not considered capable,
Or,
worthy,
or even human.
or human, and therefore you could not do something like own property or do anything except whatever they said you could do. But nonetheless, even at the point that it was taken over by someone else, your grandmother stayed for a while and continued running it for a time. Is that not correct?
It was only about 6 months.
Okay.
I mean, that was the time it took her to escape.
Okay. All right.
Her sister stayed on, and she lived in the flat behind the cinema. And of course, they were then being paid less, the
Right.
two sisters, than they actually had to pay for the cinema staff.
Right. Right. And so, I mean, everything was operating at a loss, and it was done that way, of course, so that someone else could come and take it over and say, you don't know how to run a cinema.
Yeah, no,
Right.
there's lots of letters saying, oh, you owe all this money, when I can't see how they did
Right.
owe it money from
Right.
earlier.
Right. So you were talking how your grandmother had to essentially beg for money to get out of the country because of taxes. So
Yes.
explain that a little bit more about, the process of getting from Vienna to London.
Well, you basically, the Nazis didn't really mind if, in the early days, so this is 1938, if the Jews left, provided they left with nothing. So she had to prove that she'd paid all her tax that was owing. All the cinema tax was paid, and then she had to pay exit tax which was really high. Now, the assets she'd got was the flat, which might have been very smart, but was rented. So there was nothing there. The cinema had already been confiscated. And anyway, her sister needed whatever. So she tried to sell her furniture, but every other Jew in Vienna was selling furniture.
Right.
The other thing she had to do, she had to get lots of permits. She had to get a permit proving that she paid all her tax. She had to get a permit to cross Germany to get to a neutral country. She had to get an entry permit for Britain because we weren't that welcoming of refugees. So she needed an affidavit which essentially said, I will support this person. They will, not be a charge on the state. So she had to get that from England. And these permits didn't last for very long. So before you had to get all your ducks in a
row very quickly. Yes.
And if you didn't, you had to start again. And you literally had to queue outside the embassies and things, with the SS and the thugs beating people up and jeering. It must have been terrifying.
I can't even imagine. She was able to get your dad out faster than that. Was that just because she did it so quickly?
Well, he was younger. It was also, yes.
Yeah.
Very quickly. His half brother was in London, so he sent the affidavit. But because his dad had been killed in this car accident, there was the compensation from the car claim, which hadn't been used. Peter, my dad, got it because it would support him till he was finished education or was an adult. My grandmother didn't have it because she had an income from the cinema.
Right.
So that money hadn't been touched. So the funds were there. Because he was a minor, it was much cheaper. There was no, he didn't have a business interest.
Right. He didn't have the taxes to pay and the other things. So
he was 16.
Right.
He was 17 in 2 weeks when he came to England. And he made that journey across Europe on his own, which again must have been pretty scary.
It must have been terrifying. How close was he with his half brother when he went?
I don't think he was fantastically close. There's a really big age difference because my grandmother married. She's very beautiful, and she married the first man who took her to Vienna and had a baby, and then discovered he was unfaithful and rushed back to her parents and brought over the baby. And so Eric was years older than he was very lazy at school. Because he got a single mum who quite indulged him, I think. The only subject he worked at was English because he wanted to come and see his big brother.
Okay. So at least for him, where he was going, I mean, I'm sure it was terrifying, but he had someplace kind of safe to land.
Well, yes, but
yes and no, but
yes, no, because Eric had written, he married in the early 30s and moved to London as the sales rep for an engineering company, Austrian engineering company. And he'd written saying, oh, well, we live in Streatham. Now, Streatham is a suburb of South London that was still being built in parts of it in those days. Oh, well, it's not quite London, but, the road, they may be not paved in gold, but it's lovely, it's really nice. But of course, by the time Peter got there, he'd lost his job because the Austrian engineering firm was making armaments and didn't need a sales rep. So he hadn't told his mum because he didn't want to worry her. So Peter arrived in quite a small flat to find that Eric is doing whatever work he can get.
Right.
That's where my grandmother went as well at first.
Okay. And how long did your grandmother stay there when she finally was able to get to London? How long did she stay with her two sons?
I think she realized she was an intrusion quite early on. It was a small flat.
Right.
Peter was already sleeping on the sofa. And she moved. You get these registration books which show where people were, because if you're an enemy alien, you have to sign in.
Right.
So she went from Streatham to a cheap pension in sort of Bloomsbury quite quickly.
Okay.
She arrives in December, and she's in Tynemouth in January.
Okay.
With
So she very quickly realized that this tiny place wasn't a place for mom and two boys and a daughter-in-law. So yeah. Okay. Did she immediately then begin working for this girls' home? Was that the
Yes,
first job that she picked up then in England, right?
that was a piece of luck in some ways, because a friend of hers from Vienna, Alice Erbach, was a really famous cook.
Mm-hmm.
And she had already got the job as matron of this hostel on the grounds they needed a cook matron, and why not use a famous Viennese cook?
Right.
And Alice recommended Paula as the second matron, which is that's how she got that job. I mean, they all did it via Woburn House, which is in Bloomsbury, and worked as a sort of saving post. It put people in touch with one another, jobs and people needing jobs.
Right.
It had a very important role.
So this hostel was specifically for Jewish girls who were being taken out of Vienna or taken
No,
out of Germany?
it was a kinder transport. After Kristallnacht, which is in November 38, when there's an orchestrated riot or a pogrom, where they smash synagogues and storefronts and do a bit of rioting and looting and killing. The press, both in America and in England, sort of suddenly realized how appalling conditions were in Germany and German-occupied lands. The Kindertransport scheme started very quickly in England. There were speeches in Parliament, on the radio, in the newspapers, saying we must do something for the children. And this is the very famous where the children are unaccompanied. So family members or friends would take the children to mainline station, hand them to strangers, and they had the luggage labels put around their necks and were escorted across Europe by these strangers. Now, they weren't all Jewish by any means.
Okay.
The helpers, many of them were Quakers, and they were people in the locality. It's the Nicholas Winton One Life film. That's the
Yeah.
Czech.
Okay. Okay.
So, two of the girls in the hostel came from Czechoslovakia. Others came from Germany and Austria.
Okay. All right. And so was, your grandmother went, it surprises me. Like, she was this, like you said, a beautiful woman who had this amazing fancy job, because at the time, theaters in 1915, when you went to the theater, you went dressed up, right? I mean, people wore their jewels and their gowns, and it was a big ordeal. It was a big deal, not like today where we just go in, t-shirts and flip-flops. And she goes from that to working essentially as a mother type,
Well,
doing laundry and helping with cooking and cleaning, and that's a big change for sewing. That's a big change for her.
Huge change. I mean, there's a photograph in the book of where she's no longer in her fancy clothes. She's got like a smock on and a scarf around her head. It must have been incredibly hard work, because I can't work out quite how many girls there were, because some came and some went.
Right.
It was, but 25 to 30 permanent, their long stay. And think about it, they had to be fed 3 times a day because they'd come home from school for lunch. No central heating, open fires, big house. I've been in both the Windermere house and the Tynemouth house, and they're lovely homes now. But then they would have had, they have big, huge windows overlooking the sea, so it'd have been very cold. The clothes were made, and they were donated, and they were made and remade to fit the children.
To fit whoever needed it at the time.
Yes, and grandmother came from this draping tradition, so she actually was very good with the sewing machine. And they had to make the curtains. I think one of the girls describes, actually, a few of the girls became seamstresses and tailors. One of the girls describes actually making the blackout blinds when they moved to Windermere, and those are really big windows.
Right, right. So this was a huge job. How much did your grandmother talk about that later in her life?
She talked about the girls, and
Uh-huh.
so I'd known about the girls, and and if a letter or postcard came, it would get read out. And I did find this lovely envelope of photographs, and they ranged from like two toddlers on a beach with no clothes on to really, really formal 1970s weddings. And so some of the girls stayed in touch, some went and visited. So there's photographs of grandmother in her flat with a couple of girls,
Right.
which is lovely. Um, she talked about Windermere and Tynemouth. She said how generous the community was, and how when they moved to Windermere, because they were only given 3 weeks to move. I still haven't worked out how they managed to do that.
Can you imagine trying to move that many people and them being young and getting them to a new location with all the furnishings and all of the things that you need to keep that kind of household going?
And well, you had to find the house as well.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was kosher, so they had to have two of everything for the kitchen.
Right, right.
None of the girls that I've spoken to can remember how they went from Windermere to Windermere, from Tynemouth to Windermere, but they think it was probably a train,
Yeah.
as we had a decent train network then. Um, it must have been a huge undertaking. Well, my grandmother's logbook shows that she actually went a couple of days early, and so she stayed in like a B&B, and is clearly trying to get the house ready. So one person can't do that.
No, there's no. I mean, when they arrived, it must have just been almost pandemonium as they're trying to figure out how are you going to take care of these children.
Well, what they did was they divided them up into little, middle, and large. And so large looked after middle, and middle looked after little. And obviously the matrons looked after the very little ones. But also, the youngest was 5.5. Which is really, really, she can't, I speak to her quite often. She lives in London. She's 90 now, but she says she can't remember anything, about leaving her parents or anything, or her
Right,
mother,
right.
or really her time in Tynemouth. She can remember Windermere, whereas others could remember much more detail.
Depending a lot on the age they were when they arrived. Right,
Some were teenagers.
right, right. Um, I think I just keep trying to imagine like how those girls must have felt. Because in addition to what your grandmother was doing in terms of like helping with the food and the clothing and whatnot, you're also dealing with children who've been ripped from their parents' arms. So there had to have been a lot of emotional upheaval.
I don't think nowadays we would ever put the owner of a cinema and a
No,
celebrity cook, who both had boy children, in charge of traumatized girls.
no, like,
It's very interesting. The girls seem to have understood enormously the matron's position, the matron situations. Some resented it, some resented the whole thing, some were very, very unhappy, and hated everything. Others were more pragmatic and made the best of it. And of course,
right.
the thing, they didn't know that their parents weren't going to survive.
Yeah, and that's the most horrific part is out of all of those girls, did any of them ever have a parent survive it?
Yes. One did. I mean, one did. I mean, in fact, her dad was in England in the army throughout the war, and her mum survived a camp. But it then took nearly 2 years before mum was sent to Canada
Right,
to because they didn't have the sort of treatment we have. They were starving. They couldn't throw
right,
food at them,
right.
and so it was 2 years before she was fit enough to travel. By then, the hostel was closed, and the daughter was in Scotland with the dad. And the heart-rending bit is that the daughter, when mum comes in to meet her daughter, she goes, "Oh, but where is she?" Because she's expecting a little girl, not a young woman.
Oh, how that's just heartbreaking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that was.
I can't imagine. Did any of the girls like talk about how that transition, how difficult that was for them? Because this is emotionally traumatizing. Like were they given any help with that, or did they just have to kind of figure it out on their own?
Dasha, who is 92 and in Australia and did a psychology degree later,
Yeah.
um, she sort of wrote, "Oh well, you know, after a while it dawned on us we weren't living in a hostel, more of an orphanage." I think the matrons tried quite hard to shield the girls because I don't think during the war people actually knew what was going
No,
on.
I don't think so either. Yeah.
But then there was this story that when the newsreels started after the war, now grandmother in both Tynemouth and Windermere, grandmother negotiated a free trip to the cinema every week for the children to improve their language. But when the newsreels started showing the camps, the matrons forbade going to the cinema. But of course, one girl, they're teenagers, one girl
That
sneaked in,
sneaks and goes, right?
and is horribly distressed and faints. And of course, cinema sort her out. They call a matron, and a police car takes them home. So that you've got that sort of kindness. But no, actually, the girls haven't said. I don't think they did get that.
Right. And like you said, it's not like they said, okay, we're going to set up this hostel and we're going to make sure that, like in today's world, we would have a child's therapist, and we would have very
Yeah.
specific people with very specific roles. And instead what they did was they said, we have these girls and we need two women to run a place.
Well, I think one thing is that they didn't know how they assumed it was temporary when they
Right.
started out.
How
That
long did the hostel end up running? Let's get that out there just so people understand. It was supposed to be temporary, and it lasted how long?
till 1946.
Yeah.
So it ran throughout the war. It ran from 39 to 46.
Yeah. So 7 years is not very
Yeah.
temporary.
Yes.
Right.
And the committee, which is one of the things my father really wanted to acknowledge, was the committee that set up and ran the hostel. They did. There was they did visit. A lot of the girls were very, very fond of Mrs. Friedman, who was one of the committee members, who used to go and read stories to them and things like that. So there was. It wasn't just the matrons on their own.
Right.
There was
Right.
some oversight, and it's quite clear from the paperwork that the authorities had oversight as well. So there were reports on each child.
Right.
So it wasn't just this house with these two women and
Right. 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 But the day to day was.
yes,
Yeah, the
but
day to day was very much
the
the,
girls had to do a lot as well because
right.
they all learned to cook from Mrs. Obuck. They were quite proud of that.
Okay.
And some of them learned to sew, but they had to go and collect firewood because of open fires. They had to go because Alice was very good at foraging and making things. They had muesli, which nobody had before, but they had to go blackberrying and things like that. Now that was really some of the girls really loved the freedom and said how beautiful it all was, and yet Elfie said no, we hated it. It was cold and it prickled our fingers.
Right. Right. So I was going to bring that up because that's something, as I was reading the book, that I noticed is that there were some very different opinions from the girls as to, what it was like in the
Yeah,
hostel. And some were just, it was, the best of a bad situation, and that the women running it were wonderful, and that and then there were others who didn't have that opinion, and they had kind of a negative outlook about where they were and who ran it and how it was run, and everything. They had that opinion. How did that feel to you, knowing that it was your grandmother that was one of those? Did it?
I think I look. I think that the two matrons did their best in very difficult
Right.
circumstances. Um, I, they've all been really all the girls that I've met, the women that I've met, because I haven't met all of them. Some of them wrote to my dad,
Yeah.
um, aren't alive. Were at pains to say that my grandmother was always kind. Um, I think it was an impossible situation for everyone.
Right. I can imagine, like, it would depend a lot on the personality of the child, how old the child was when they left, where they were in their whole development. Could they say this is a horrible situation and we're making the most of it, or were they not in a space that they could say that?
I think you've got that. I think one thing, you've got that continuum.
Yes.
Some, Elfie was terribly pragmatic. She said, "Look, the clothes were secondhand. They were remade for us, but they were fabulous quality. Because they were all donated in Newcastle."
Right.
Another said, "Well, we had to wear all these dreary secondhand clothes. It wasn't
And it
war,
was the same thing, right?
and it
Yeah.
wasn't war, and nobody had new clothes then anyway."
Right.
One pattern is clear, that the very young children, in some ways, it was slightly easier for them. So they didn't know they couldn't remember what family life was like.
So this is what they knew.
Well, they
Right.
if you're only 5, you've forgotten what family life is like by the
Right.
time you're 10. And so the institutional aspect was less hard on some of them.
Right. Right.
Um, I think it really just depended on their personalities to some extent.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Can you tell us why you decided to write this? Like, I know that personally, like, this would be great to know about your family, but what made you say, I don't only want to know about it, but I want to write about it. I want to put it in a book.
Well, partly it was because I'd got my dad's manuscripts that he hadn't published, and I wanted to do something with that.
Mm-hmm.
Partly it's because I'm used to professionally, when I had a day job, I was used to writing. And so it was a way of organizing. It started as a table and expanded into chapters. And I suppose some of the information is fairly, I'm privileged to have the sort of correspondence with the girls.
Exactly. I think that makes the story really incredible. Is it's not just from the point of view of your grandmother and your father, but also from people that your grandmother helped take care of, and then what happened to them as they went forward. It's lovely to see that even in a horrific event, that there were people who could still flourish after.
Yes, the BBC Newcastle have done a really lovely series of podcasts about the Tynemouth Hostel. It's called The Girls,
Mm-hmm.
and they've actually got interviews. They've got some of the girls, and they actually had archive interviews with some of the other girls. So they tell the story as, well, 5 podcasts, but then there was a new one last summer about one of the photographs at Liverpool Street Station. So that it's just one tiny bit of the book,
Right.
and other people's books as well. It's not just mine, but
Right.
it's a lovely bit of the story, and the way they've done it is beautiful.
Wonderful. So now the war's over. They're closing down the hostel. I think a lot of people assume that when war is over, everything just goes back to where it had been. It's like, okay, the war is over. Now we're just, go back to, 1936, 1937, and that's not the way it is.
I was really surprised. That was one of the things that surprised me more than most in researching the book, was the absolute chaos and devastation at the end of the war. Europe has been bombed flat,
Right.
either by the Germans or the Brits. The chaos in that grandmother did have a niece who survived. She survived Theresienstadt, one of the camps. But it's 2 years before anybody knows whether or not Fritz is alive.
Right.
Because she's got to recover from being in a camp and make her way back to Brno. Actually, her husband survived as well. So they have to, start out. They've lost everything, and they have to make a new life. And at some point, it becomes clear that she is alive. It's the same with the girls. I think it dawned on them quite slowly that there were no relatives that were, there were no
Nobody's
immediate.
coming.
Well, I think
Right.
many of them found a distant relative
Okay.
or a sibling, but no, and I think that took quite some time.
Right.
And
Right.
I mean, like grandmother, she'd lost her cinema, though she did get it back in the end. Um, she needed money to live off. By then, she's 65 or 64.
Right. Right.
She saved. She was paid like £2 or £3 a week while she was working in the hostel, and she's given Peter. And while Peter was a student, while my dad was a student, she's given him £1 a week. Um, and she saved what she could, but she's got to support herself for through her old age.
Right. Right.
I, physically, she's by the end of the hostel, she's not strong. But she basically got a house and ran it as a letting house with breakfast for her 4 gentlemen.
Mm-hmm. And that she's almost suited for that at this point, because that's what she spent the last 7 years doing, but for a much larger crowd.
Well, no, because Mrs. Alice did all the cooking.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
did the sewing and the ledgers and the things like that. Actually, she was a terrible cook.
So her 4 gentlemen probably weren't too happy with their breakfast. Is that?
I mean, she'd never had, because she was running a cinema. They had a maid to look after the flat and do the cooking.
Right. Right.
With Alice did the cooking because she was a superb cook.
Right, because she was the one that was a famous cook.
Yes.
So
no, I can't say that my grandmother was a great cook.
when you remember going to visit your grandmother.
Oh, yes.
And so was she at that time, was she in the home that she had been in when she had the gentleman, or was she now in something smaller?
That only lasted a few years.
Okay.
She was stateless, so she couldn't go back to Vienna to find
Exactly.
out. And she's stateless for a few years. My dad got British nationality. In fact, he was the first to be naturalised after the war, because he was in the Royal Navy, and that was the senior service. So because he was in naval intelligence, the Navy very kindly let him go to Vienna, which is when he discovered that the cinema had operated throughout the war with no investment, so it was really dilapidated. It changed its name. It was no longer the Palace Kino. It was now the Palace Glücksspiele, and that's because Hitler didn't like the word kino because it was Greek. So all cinemas had become Glücksspiele. And he also discovered that the family hadn't survived.
Right.
And so he puts in a very distant relative as a manager. And I've got bits of the correspondence between my grandmother and this manager. At first, it's quite clear. Grandmother is said, she's asking grandmother how to run the cinema by post. And that goes on for quite a while. And then grandmother makes it back to Vienna and is obviously really upset about the state of the cinema. And so she spends, it's 1953 before she actually, the cinema is returned quite quickly, but the arguing about whose it is and this, that, and the other, it's 1953 and it ends up being sold. And a nephew has taken a share by then. We can't find the court papers for that one.
Right.
But this nephew gets an illegal boat to Palestine at the beginning of the war, spends the war in Palestine. And I mean, it's just the same as people make these terrible journeys across the Mediterranean now.
Exactly. Right.
It's just the opposite direction. And the British are no more helpful because they won't let them land. So you have to debark onto a little boat and make a perilous journey. Anyway, he comes back and puts a counterclaim in for the cinema, and grandmother was always very bitter that she didn't get what she thought was fair.
Mm-hmm. No, I can imagine. I mean, she had what was a very good life doing what she very much wanted to do, and it was ripped from her. And then even in the end, she didn't get back what she gave up.
she didn't get what she thought was fair.
Right.
But by then, she's moved to London to be near her sons.
Okay. All right. And so that's where you remember going to see your grandmother, was when she was in London.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, when I was born, my parents lived sort of like 2 blocks along from my grandmother in Bayswater. And then when my sister came along, we moved to North London because children need a garden.
Right.
But I also remember going to see the family in Newcastle who'd taken my father in. He never left one of them. So I do remember that going up there and that big house.
Wonderful. So at what point did you realize that you were going to write this book?
I suppose in 2019, when we were in Vienna,
Okay.
and I very cheekily emailed all the. In Vienna, you have a sort of beautiful facade, and then behind that, you have lots of apartments. And I emailed all the occupants of the apartments explaining about grandmother. And we had one invitation for coffee and homemade strudel. And it turned out it was grandmother's flat.
Oh, how wonderful that must have been to see that.
It was. I must admit, I nearly cried.
Well, of course.
Our hosts were wonderful because they'd already been to the archive. They were a bit intrigued by my cheek, I think, and the story. And so they got loads of papers from the archives, and then they told us, where to go, which archives to go to, who to ask for. They were completely wonderful, and the archives were amazing because we turned up. We don't speak German. We didn't have an appointment, so we didn't really know what we were doing. And they just, yes, you can, yes, here, we'll get you the papers, yes. And then you may remember there was a lockdown.
I may remember that.
They went on sending papers, and of course, it was a very, it was a really. I had time,
Right.
So that's sort of when it really took off, I think.
Let's talk a little bit about the research. You bring up the archives that were there in Vienna, right? What other resources did you have, were you able to use to find the information that you needed?
There was an awful lot of information on the web. They're digitizing a lot of Jewish databases and, burial records and things. Now, if I was doing it now, if I was starting again, would you like me to say what I would do if I was starting again?
Sure. Go ahead and tell me. What would you do if you were going to start again?
I would use Ancestry and MyHeritage or one of those big databases.
Okay.
I didn't. I used Genie. I used the free version of Genie. But there is so much stuff there. I think you have to be really careful that you're actually looking at the right stuff and the stuff for your family, because a lot of this is put together by individuals. I know when I first started on Genie, I made a mistake, and one of the moderators very kindly put my mistake right. But it's really easy to do.
Right, right. You can you think that you know that this person belongs with this person, and you find out later that that's the wrong Mary. Yes.
Then you see you've got the problem when you're looking at something. Is this right? Can this be right? So sometimes it can't be right.
Right.
We had one, and on a later visit to Vienna, we had one help from one of the archivists, and we couldn't work out whether my great grandfather was married twice, had 2 wives, or because there was this Adela and this Harudi, and we couldn't find a second marriage or anything.
Right.
The archivist took one look at it and said, "Oh, but Harudi is the Yiddish name for Adela."
And it was like, now you didn't have to worry anymore. It was one wife, and now you knew, right?
The earliest stuff, the names, the spelling changes all the time.
That even happens in United States records. My family came over from Germany in the 1700s, and we were Poffenmeyers in Germany, And in the United States, we became Bolfenmeyers with a B instead of a P. And then they started spelling it all different kinds of ways. And so my last name growing up was Buffmeyer, but it was spelled with 2 E's, with 1 E, with 2 F's, with IE, EIER, with, I mean, like, and it changed even within family members. Like there might be 4 brothers and all 4 of them are Bolfenmeyers, but they're all spelled differently. So yeah.
I mean, the other problem you've got is if you're looking at a historical record that's handwritten, you may not be able to
can you read it? Right.
So there was all that stuff. The Holocaust data, there is a lot. I mean, some of it is, it's fairly shocking when your great aunt's death certificate just appears on your screen.
Right.
Now, there, if you know their family name and their place of birth and date of birth, sometimes you can do it on family name and place and date of birth. Then you can, if you know what you're looking, if you know which camp to look in, then you might find it.
Then you might find it, right?
I mean, I even found the Fritzy, the one that survived Theresienstadt, and that list was much shorter to go through.
Because there weren't many survivors.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, which camp was she in?
Theresienstadt. She was in the ghetto.
Yeah.
What I haven't found is I can't find her husband anywhere because I don't know when he was born.
Right. Right. You don't have enough information to get back to, and he could have been anywhere because it's not like they kept husbands and wives together.
No. Oh, I know he wasn't in Theresienstadt because she told me he was in a different camp.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's the only one that you know he wasn't in, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the probability is it was one further east because that's where they moved. I mean, I've also learned a lot about what happened to people in general.
Right. You tell a story at the very end of the book about yourself, about the ability to go ahead and get your birth certificate. To not a birth certificate, that's the wrong word, to get your citizenship.
Yes. The
right?
the Austrians recognized that terrible wrongs were done. And they were a bit late coming to getting that message.
Right. I don't think people like to admit when such atrocities happen. And so, it's, if you keep denying it, maybe it will go away. But
I think that might be part of it, yes. Anyway, so one of the ones they're trying to make reparations is they've offered the children of victims of National Socialism the opportunity to apply for citizenship. And I have to say, I applied virtually before the scheme was open. That was really because because of the problem we have with Brexit, that I am strongly pro-European and was horrified when Britain decided to commit suicide by voting for Brexit. And so I wanted a European passport. Whether my sister won't do it, and I know people who say, well, why would I want the passport from a country where they killed my relatives?
Right. But you have a reason that you said that you don't ever want to be in a position where you can't move about freely.
Very, very much so.
And that is because of everything that you learned about your grandmother and your father not being able to move freely.
Absolutely. I mean, an old friend said when I said I was applying for citizenship, and he just said, well, what do you think your dad would say? And I think because when the Austrians offered Peter back his citizenship, he told them in extraordinarily anatomical terms what they
do with it. Right. His opinion, though, was based a lot on high emotion and, after all that you've done. But you believe that he'd understand your reasoning.
I think he'd be very, very sad. I can't imagine what his reaction to Brexit would be. It would be extremely anatomical.
Yeah.
Be very, very sad that living in England, I'm unlikely to move, but that I even think that there's a risk. So yes, I think he'd be saddened, but I think I hope he'd understand.
I think he would. I think that he would look and say, my daughter is doing what she feels needs to be done, because he would never want you in the same situation he found himself in.
Absolutely not. No.
So, yeah. Yeah. How else do you think what happened to your family, the stories that you've been told, the things that you learned, how has that affected you and like what you do in your daily life, or how you lived your life as an adult?
But of course, you don't know when you're a child that perhaps what your childhood is a bit unusual. When I was young, we used to get taken to grandmother, and she'd be sitting. There'd be this room that was massively overheated, and there'd be all these European ladies talking in some language that I could never understand because I don't speak German, but they didn't actually seem to speak proper German either. They just sort of spoke this polyglot, and they spent a lot of time crying, and I didn't realize. I don't think you do realize as a child that that's not what grannies do.
Right.
So, how has it changed me as an adult? Well, I'd like to think that I stand up for underdogs.
Yeah.
Things like that. I do tell the story.
And I think it's important that you tell the story, because the further away we get from those atrocities, the more people who are no longer alive to remember them firsthand, the dimmer it becomes.
That's a really big problem, because obviously the old ladies now, there used to be, Ruth David Oppenheimer, one of the girls, went around schools telling them
the story. Right.
She's one of the ones on Woman's Hour. I mean, she's one of the ones on the podcast.
Right.
Now, obviously, Ruth died of COVID, very sadly, and that it's never going to be the same story. I can't tell Ruth's story.
No, you can only tell what you remember of Ruth's story, and you can't tell it with the same feeling because you don't have those experiences. So that's what often happens in history, right? Is that we only then have what's written down. And so I think that's why it's so important that you have written down, and that you have the letters, and you have the things that your father wrote, and you have the things from your grandmother, and you have that all there, is so that there is a real record.
Well, yes, and I've tried hard to put it together, if you like, fairly.
Right.
Because I'm not a historian. I've tried to tell the story as it seems most likely to me.
Right. Right.
Where there's something to corroborate other things.
What do you want readers to get from this? When they're done reading and they walk away from this book, what do you want them to have gotten from it?
I suppose the things that you've already highlighted, the idea that war is devastating, not just in the 6 million Jews that were killed, and the even more Russians that were killed, but you've destroyed land and buildings and infrastructure. I mean, there was no infrastructure after the war, and yet there was just no transport, say in Austria. There's no, people were living literally in holes in the road because there's no electricity, or buildings have lost all their windows. You've got all of that. And I mean, to me, the most important thing is freedom, and the freedom, this freedom from oppression, but there's also freedom to say within reason to have your own opinion.
Right.
I think all things like that are really, they're what's important to me. And if people got a little bit of that from the book, that would be brilliant.
Yeah. Well, I think they do. I know that I did. I found it to be a very, very eye-opening, there were times that I felt like I was going to cry. There were other times that I felt very, very happy, like to read the stories of the girls that have now, grown, and that all, I don't know, somehow it was like, oh, good, at least some good has come from some of this horrific, horrible mess that people do to one another. Do you plan on writing anything else, or was this your one big thing?
No, I'm not planning, but I think I will. I mean, I write odd short things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to work out what it is I'd like to write next, I think.
Yeah. So do you think that it would be something else that's nonfiction like this, or do you think you would delve into more of a novel or a memoir of your own? Or
I don't think my life's very interesting, so I don't think that. I don't think I've got the imagination to write a novel, unfortunately. So it'll have to be something where I mean, what I really enjoy doing is the research. So
right.
It'll have to be something that's based on a scaffold, even if from the scaffold it sort of falls off and becomes more.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's good. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, Vivien, about this book or about things that you learned, or, you know, even, hey, what databases did you use and how might I find them as well? How do they get in touch with you?
Well, I've got a website, which is Vivien Sieber .eu, and it's Vivien Sieber, all one word.
Okay. And I'll have it in the show notes so that people can find it.
And there is a contact form on that.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Is there anything that you wish that I had asked you that I haven't asked?
No, I don't think so. I think one thing that I perhaps should have said is that the girls were just so pragmatic, and you know, talking to Inge, who's 19, living in Wimbledon. I mean, she was the youngest child in the hostel. She was 5.5. Her sister was about 8.5. She had a baby sister who was too young to travel, and so she and her mum didn't survive. Her dad wasn't Jewish and had deserted. So, but Inge, after the war, when the hostel closed, she was still too young, so she was sent to a hostel in Manchester. And they went from a very small community and school to a big, rather rough community, and were very unhappy. Then they went to Israel, and Inge came back, and her sister stayed. Now, Inge just sort of went, well, I got on with it. I didn't have any, but I didn't have any choice. I had to get on with it.
Right, right. And there is a lot of that. I mean, there's a lot. When you're going through difficult things, it's okay to have the good cry, but often you end up having to say, the only thing to do is move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, grandmother just got on with it.
Yeah, like what else is there to do? I guess you could just sit down and quit, but that often isn't even an option. It's you survive, and so you just move forward.
Well, the ones who didn't leave didn't survive. When you've got the ones in Austria, of grandmother's siblings, her sister-in-law had a disabled child, so she didn't leave because the disabled child was too sick to travel. And in fact, the disabled child was arrested very quickly, and I can't find out what happened to him, so I think he died on a transport. Sister-in-law ends up murdered in a camp. Her other son is the one that went to Israel. Paula's brother was married to a Catholic, so he thought he'd be safe. Spent much of the war in hiding in Brno or Prague. But then his wife died. It was a failed operation. He lost his protection and went to Auschwitz. Another one died, but actually just before he could be transported to a camp. So you've got this very interesting question about my grandmother. Then she had the prescience to escape,
right? And
one of the things she always felt bad about was that she hadn't persuaded any of her family to escape too.
And she tried. She tried. Oh, yeah. She really pushed people to please come. It's time. Get out. But for various reasons, they wouldn't or couldn't.
Yeah, and I think she always felt guilty about that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot to that survivor's guilt. I made it and they didn't. And what if I had been able to persuade them, or what if I had forced them somehow, or, and that's not the way it works either. So, well, this has been a wonderful, difficult, but wonderful story. And I think it's one that people should read, because I am definitely of the opinion that if you don't understand history, it will repeat itself until you do understand it. And this is not something that we want to see happening again, and that we need to understand and not forget those atrocities that happened. So I want to thank you for doing that research and, putting yourself and your family out there for those of us to read and to try to understand just a little bit more about what happened during the war.
Well, thank you.
Okay. So thank you so much for being on the show, Vivien.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.